presentation of this conference, and this time we're going to switch gears to a completely different topic. And I'm going to talk about equine disease in a little bit more detail. Primarily one of the leading conditions I see in horses that is rarely diagnosed and very misunderstood, and that is all about gut health in horses. And that really comes down to the three underlying causes of disease. Okay. So whenever I am working on a particular horse, and it doesn't matter how severe the problem is or how mild the problem is or how long the horse has been unwell for or what type of condition it is, the first and foremost thing that I have to do is identify the underlying cause of disease. And there's only three. And I say that like it's simple because underneath those underlying causes, there's quite a few subcategories of these topics as well. So the first one is nutrient deficiencies. I can't tell you how many times I see this being a real cause of real serious problems in horses, and multis don't cut it. So if you are trying to use multi-minerals and vitamins and all those synthetic blends, I have tried to get them to work over and over and over again. I cannot do it for a lot of horses. Some horses you'll get improvement, but there's a lot of problems with them that I can go into in another time. But when you're trying to correct specific nutrient deficiencies, you have to do it through specific nutrients, using specific dosages. Be really clear about what you're trying to give that horse. And one of the reasons why nutrient deficiencies are so prevalent is because a lot of the horses that are living worldwide are not on this, right? They're not on forage. They don't have access to this. They're eating hay, right? And hay is dried grass. It's dead grass. And so a lot of the nutrients comes out of hay that horses never get access to. And that is why you see this real distribution out there of information about feeding multis, balancing minerals to hay, because we all know that hay doesn't have enough, but the multis aren't that effective, especially for unwell horses that have digestive problems already. They're not absorbing their nutrients very well as it is. And so it's just a lot better to get very simple with horses. That's the way they like it. So that's the first one. The second one, which I'm going to focus on today, is toxicity. Toxicity is prevalent everywhere. There is no country that's absolved of toxicity for horses and for humans. And that includes a lot of different things, which I'm going to go over. But the relationship between disease and health is digestion, right? Like it's all the things that are going into our horse's mouth that are causing cell death, they're causing damage to tissues, and they're putting a lot of strain on the body so it can't even respond like it normally would. And the third cause of stress, which is usually when you see unwell horses, it's not just one thing, it's usually a combination of things, and stress is always involved. So we've heard a lot about stress over the last 2 days in horses. It's very real, and a stressed horse can't heal, and a stressed horse can't recover. And it can be anything from physical stress to emotional stress to mental stress. And I have a podcast available called The Chemistry of Stress, and I would highly encourage you all to listen to it. You will really get a good understanding of what's happening in the body when a horse is worried, fearful, under a lot of pressure, confined, lonely, taken out of their natural environment. It's a killer. Like it kills horses all the time. We see thousands of horses die from stress alone. So today we're going to focus on toxicity, and the definition of toxicity is the degree to which a substance causes damage to a cell, tissue, organ, body system, or organism. So what you'll see with a lot of horses when you see a baby horse, for example, so a horse that's just brand new to the world, they're perfect. It's then we get involved, the earth gets involved, and then things start to decline from a health perspective. So a healthy young horse has detoxification pathways already built in. They know how to detoxify a lot of different things in their environment. But we add so much more toxicity through medications, chemicals, vaccinations, the over-deworming, that eventually, and the sweet spot is usually about 14 or 15 years old, that all of a sudden the owner gets a diagnosis, or all of a sudden there's a health event, some sort of crisis happens. And it didn't start in that moment. It started at 5 years old with the onset of all the chemicals and all the crap we're putting into their bodies, literally. So what we want to do always when you're trying to recover your horse or promote better health is put things in place to detoxify them as chemicals are going in, because we can't always do anything about that. You have to deworm, right? Like that's just necessary, especially if you've got horses out on grass. They're domestic, they have high parasite loads. There are certain things you've got to do. But what happens is those same horses don't have a lot of support. So then you throw in nutrient deficiencies into this, and now they don't have the nutrients to detoxify the body either. So a lot of nutrients are required to sustain healthy detoxification. Horses rarely have enough. And one of the most common ones, just as an example, is selenium. There are 90% of horses are selenium deficient, and it's a huge detoxifier, really important for the liver, really important for the hair coat, the hooves. And when they don't have enough, how can you ever expect to chelate toxins out of the liver? It becomes very, very hard to do. So here's some toxicity examples, and there's a lot more here, but these are the ones I see the most common. Chemicals. So this is a worldwide issue, I'm going to say, that everybody's talking about, which is the use of fertilizers, preservatives, additives, the glyphosate, right, on all the crops. It is a really powerful and really dangerous chemical, and it might not kill a horse with one bale, right, eating a bale that's been sprayed. But when they're living on this year after year after year, you start to see the effects of accumulated toxicity for sure. Pathogens. So pathogens are another source of toxicity. Horses can't live without them. They're very friendly for horses in a lot of ways. They help build the immune system. They create an entire microbiome, which I'm going to talk about later. But when that balance starts to get out of control the wrong way, you get horses with a lot of infections. They can be bacterial infections, viral infections, or parasitic infections. And usually this happens in horses that are already weakened in some way. Their immune system just can't keep up with whatever's going on in the body. Another one that I'm really tackling with every program I do is excess sugar, which comes from grass, it comes from hay, and it comes from commercial grains. That's usually the top 3 places you're going to find too much sugar in the horse's diet. But the other one, which is a little bit less, probably the awareness isn't as high, is alfalfa. And you can kill a horse with a high alfalfa diet too. I've seen that plenty of times with symptoms just as bad as high sugar. So you never want to sustain a horse on 100% alfalfa diets, right? It should be used as a supplement, not a staple. And the reason is because horses' stomachs are very small compared to the rest of the digestive system, and that's where all the protein is broken down. So legume is not a good source of fuel for energy. It doesn't help support the microbiome, and it doesn't have a useful source of fiber. So we want to stay away from alfalfa as a staple, but certainly I can use alfalfa in a lot of ways for extra protein or sometimes extra calories if it's necessary. And then the dietary fats. So when I'm trying to increase fats in a horse for nutritional purposes, so in hay, when you first cut hay, probably half of the essential fatty acids and fat-soluble nutrients drop very quickly. Within days and weeks of it being cut. So this is a very common deficiency in horses. And that's why a lot of the industry is using oil, concentrated oil, because we're always trying to take shortcuts as humans, right? It is a bad idea to do that. Horses don't have a gallbladder. They're not designed to eat oils and fats like carnivores, like dogs do, for example, or even like we do. So wherever I can, if I'm trying to build essential fatty acids into the diet, or I'm trying to put more vitamin E, which is an important fat-soluble nutrient, I will try and do it with food first. I will try to do it with food and maybe some specific nutrients that I know is enough. Sometimes it's not, and if I'm using dietary fats, it's short-term, small dosages. I never exceed a tablespoon usually if I'm trying to build up essential fatty acids in horses. And then excess acid production in the body is a toxin. So this is what I was talking about yesterday in my presentation when someone asked about improving the microbiome. There's a lot of excess acidity in horses, and that comes from all the other toxins in the diet. It comes from excess sugar, excess protein, excess fats in the diet, too many chemicals, too many medications, and when the system becomes too acidic, we start to get damage, and we start getting damage to the gut as well. And the excess production of insulin and cortisol. So insulin's related to sugar consumption, but it's also related to inflammation. And I've seen a lot of horses on a low sugar diet. They're not on grass, but they have very high insulin because they've had sore feet for 10 years. So there's a lot of localized inflammation, a lot of general inflammation, and there might be some inflammation from other sources, not grass or sugar necessarily, but they are considered toxic when they get to exceed amounts that the horse can handle because they both break down tissue, they both cause damage, and they both cause inflammation. So when you have this picture happening in a horse, you will have a very broken horse, right? They will be full of inflammation, they will be full of swelling, their immune systems will be poor, so you'll start seeing things like chronic infections, inhalant allergies, just things that never used to happen. And all of a sudden you're like, what happened to my horse? He was always so healthy. That's usually kind of the story I hear. So we're going to talk about healthy digestion because this is where it starts. And if you're going to really support your horses, you have to look after their gut health. That's really number one. And it does go a long ways, not only for prevention, but also for recovery. So a horse's hindgut, so you can see in the diagram here where the stomach is, how small it is compared to the rest of the gut. So the stomach here is right in the middle. It's 10% of the entire digestive tract. So we're not focusing food that the stomach has to break down because it's not big enough to do that. And that's basically protein. What we're focused on is the rest of the digestive system, which is the cecum and the large intestine. So it can contain, I think it's like 65 liters of volume or something like that in the hindgut at any one time. And it's a huge fermentative vat. And that's where your horse is breaking down all their fiber for energy, right? That's where all the function comes from. So that is, anatomically speaking, that's really where we want to focus. So the horse's digestive system contains about 10 to the 15 bacterial cells. So just to go back to basic math, that's 10 with 15 zeros. It's a lot of bacteria that sit back there. And bacteria populations in the hindgut ferment complex and structural carbohydrates. So when your horse is eating grass, forage, hay, that's what's happening in the hindgut. That's where it's all going. And why we care about this is fermentation produces all the volatile fatty acids as their energy source. So up to 75% of a horse's required energy comes from fiber fermentation, not sugar and not protein. And I think this is still a misconception out there a little bit because I see a lot of performance horses being loaded up full of quarts of oats every day and pails of alfalfa pellets and all these things when that's not an effective or an efficient way for them to produce energy. So when I'm trying to get a horse well again, my focus is 100% on fiber. Even though they get it from hay, you'd be amazed at how some of the excess things you can do to add more fiber can be so helpful to their general health. So the other reason we care about the fermentation in the hindgut is because it also produces nutrients. So if you have a broken hindgut in a horse, or I should say a damaged or broken microbiome, meaning that ecosystem is really faltered and it doesn't have a lot of healthy bacteria to do that fermentation process, you are already nutrient deficient, right? You're already depriving your horse of nutrition. And so because that fermentation process produces a lot of the B vitamins and amino acids. And amino acids are the byproduct of digestion of protein, aka alfalfa for horses. And so that in itself is sometimes like a huge help to just improving general wellness in a horse. So metabolism, so when we start talking about equine metabolic syndrome, Cushing syndrome, all those metabolic issues, they need every single B vitamin to do that, you know. But unfortunately for horses, a lot of those B vitamins aren't necessarily recognized as critical to their health. And so people just overlook them. They don't think about them. But I can't tell you how many horses I have brought back from the dead using B vitamins because they're not getting enough. They're already malnourished and they're deficient of many of them. So byproducts of fermentation also include methane, carbon dioxide, ammonia, water, and heat. So the other side to this is there is such a thing as the over-fermentation. If you have a horse where there's too much fermentation, you can also start poisoning them a little bit, right? Because methane, carbon dioxide, ammonia, those things are not good for horses. And then 95% of the water and electrolytes in the hindgut is reabsorbed by the body too, so it really helps with fluid balance. So we're going to talk a little bit about the equine microbiome, which was asked about yesterday. And more research is happening for horses, but there's certainly tons of research out there for humans. Usually the focal point is always on humans, so when you're looking for specific resources or information, start with the humans and then look for the horses because it's not always available. So what is the microbiome? It's a complex network of microbes that exist in a particular environment, aka the hindgut, or also known as the hindgut. That's where all the largest populations of these bacteria and pathogens exist. So bacteria, fungus, protozoa, and yeast come together and they form the microbiome in the horse. So now they're saying it's not just localized to one area of the body. Now we know the microbiome lives everywhere in all the organs. So for humans, they're discovering that each and every organ has its own microbiome. So it has its own way of communicating with other organs and with the microbiome of the gut. It is literally what keeps them alive, right? So there's lots of communication that happens not only inside the horse, but communication with the outside world too. That's how they build their immune systems when they're younger and they're off mom, so the colostrum's over, they have their innate immune system, and now they're moving through the environment learning. And this is the communication they think that takes place between the external world, all those bacteria and fungus and protozoa that they come into contact with, they're literally collecting information from. So now we know it's not just the gut, and in horses, the hindgut houses the large majority of it. And that's why we're always talking about the microbiome in the hindgut, but just know that if you're improving it there, you're probably improving the health of the microbiome everywhere in the horse. So they do depend on it for forage utilization and energy production, and the body relies on the micropopulation for all kinds of things, but inter and intracellular communication is really the forefront of research right now. So you can do a lot of going down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and looking up tons of studies that are being done with a focus on these little bugs and how important they are for our health. And every horse has a unique fingerprint of microbial populations, and I think that's really relevant too, because it also means we can't treat every horse like the next one. They all are individual, they all have different backgrounds, they were raised in different environments, they have different gene pools from their mom and their dad, and so you have to treat them as such. So certain horses are going to have certain genetic predispositions to certain problems, and we know that especially when it comes to the metabolic disorders. So the diversity of the GI tract is really critical as well, and I alluded to this yesterday because they now know that how diverse a horse's microbiome is a huge indicator on how healthy they are. So that means how good their immune systems are, how efficient they are at detoxifying, how well they metabolize, how well they digest, and maybe even how much inflammation is in the body. So the GI tract has been shown to have very distinct differences in microbial populations. For example, the ecosystem of the foregut, meaning the stomach, esophagus, that's the foregut, is very different from that of the hindgut because there's different functions. They're doing different things. So the closer they are in proximity or location, the more similarities the populations share. And they know this, research knows this, and there are papers out there that talk about that. So research is starting to suggest that it is not just the cells that maintain healthy function in the body, but rather it is the diversity. So how many different populations are there, which I believe means how much different information there is in the body and the immune system. So in Animal Microbiome, which is a journal in 2019, it stated that microbiomes of non-domesticated horses, so these are wild horses that don't live in a domestic environment, include a more diverse spectrum of microbiota compared to those of domestic horses. So this is fact, we know this, and they're also healthier. If you ever go out and watch the wild horses, they don't struggle with a lot of the health problems our domestic horses do, including all the immune-related problems, the Cushing syndrome, the ulcers, the digestive problems. They have their own way of keeping themselves healthy in the world. So this is another aspect of the microbiome that we also know, science knows this, that microbes produce chemicals and other substances that signal cellular activities and regulate metabolic pathways. I just put two on the screen, but it's a lot more complicated than this. And one of them is butyrate, so you'll hear about this for humans as well. And it's a product of fermentation that contributes to gut health and protects against disease. So if you have a horse with a very poor microbiome from too many chemicals, too much over deworming, too much sugar, too much protein, too many bad fats, too many preservatives, the list goes on, you're now protection against disease falls, right? In addition to all the malnutrition that happens in a situation like that. The other one, which you probably hear a ton of in the human industry, is glutathione. It is kind of known as the most powerful antioxidant. Vitamin C is up there, but glutathione is definitely really, I think, at the top. And that protects cells against oxidative stress, and it facilitates detoxification as well. So if the horse isn't producing these substances the way they need to, you are not detoxifying very well, your metabolism's struggling, your immune system's poor, there's more inflammation, and a horse turns 15 years old and they have chronic laminitis, they have ulcers, they have leaky gut, they have skin problems, they have inhalant allergies, and that's how a horse breaks down. That's how a horse's health breaks down, largely due to the domestic world and how we are managing their health. So this is very relevant too. There has been quite a bit of talk about dopamine levels in horses. So this is definitely another reason to look after their gut. But microbes produce neurotransmitters that send signals to the brain versus the vagus nerve. And we also know that serotonin is one, but dopamine is another. So gut bacteria produces up to 95% of the body's serotonin. So I think we need to start looking at their mental and emotional health a little bit more like a physical problem. It's not always emotional. It doesn't always come from trauma. It doesn't always come from a bad experience or not fitting in with the herd. And the reason I know that is because I literally see mental transformations just by improving nutrition. And that really has an effect on all the neurotransmitters in the brain, which are largely moderating depression and anxiety and all of those, I would say the ability for a horse to manage stress comes down to this too, right? So a lot of these neurotransmitters, the balance of them can really determine how your horse's threshold of stress is holding. And horses that don't have good nutrition and can't detoxify and have very poor gut health and don't have the mental or brain health to go with it have more anxiety, definitely. And they also have a lot more depression as well. So the role of dopamine in the body and in the brain, it's responsible for motor skills, cognitive abilities, memory, and learning. It produces feelings of pleasure, and it plays a key role in the reward motivation system. So Lucy talked about that yesterday. So, you know, when a horse feels like they did something well, or they have pride in a job or task they just did, that dopamine lights up in their brain. But there's a lot of things that light up the dopamine in the brain. But what I'm concerned about is low levels of dopamine. And low levels of dopamine can cause lethargy, muscle stiffness, fatigue, apathy, and depression. And I see this go along with almost every metabolic problem I see, including pain. So acute laminitis, for example, and all of those health conditions. It can also cause poor concentration, ADD, digestive problems, and weight gain. And this is really a good symptom picture for all the equine metabolic syndrome out there, as well as the Cushing syndrome as well. And one key point here is one of the biggest rewards you can offer a horse is sugar, right? You know, like you come with a sugar bucket, molasses, or a bunch of grass, especially for a horse that's not used to having it, their whole brain lights up. You can see it in their eyes. And so this is also something you see in horses that don't have a very good regulation of blood sugar or insulin. So I just want to allude to PPID quickly because it is a growing concern across the planet. It's getting a lot of misdiagnoses. I'm going to go out on the limb and say that. And what true PPID is that the dopamine producing cells in the brain start to die. And that's dopamine is required for regulating ACTH levels in the brain, which is produced by the pituitary gland. When ACTH gets high and stays high for too long, you then have high cortisol chronically, right? And when you have high cortisol in a horse and high ACTH, you see things like irregular shedding patterns, excessive sweating, lots of inflammation, muscle wasting. It just starts to break down tissue, and you'll see it in the horse's body. So what we want to do here is increase dopamine levels, but we want to do it in a way that makes sense for the horse and for their lifestyle without being too synthetic with it. So when specialized brain cells become degenerated, they can't produce adequate levels of dopamine. The pituitary becomes overworked and eventually becomes enlarged. And I think this is the bigger problem with Cushing syndrome than it being a pituitary problem alone. And that's why I actually prefer Cushing's as a term, because this PPID is kind of saying it's just about the pituitary. It's about a lot of things. It's about too much inflammation, too much stress, poor digestion, poor microbiome, so they're not producing healthy levels of neurotransmitters in the brain. And so if unresolved, the stress in the pituitary will cause an adenoma. That's end stage. That's at the end of the condition. So now the pituitary has been inflamed and overworked for so long, it starts to harden. And that's where you get a lot of the dysfunction that happens with chronically elevated ACTH levels. So we know this because one of the most common, widely prescribed medications for horses is pergolide, which happens to be a dopamine agonist, right? So it is affecting dopamine levels, nothing else. And that's why some horses find benefit for it just to help bring down cortisol levels. So what causes low dopamine levels from a health point of view? Lack of sleep, insulin resistance. So horses that have a lot of extra fat pads and a crested neck, lack of exercise, so they're not moving, stress. So this can be chronic stress from everything from being confined to lonely. They don't have any friends. They're in the performance world. They're, just way too much stimulation for them. A toxic hindgut, which I'm going to talk about next, and also boredom, right? Horses standing there with nothing to do all the time. And we think sometimes we're being kind to our horses by leaving them alone. And in our part of the world, that often means they stand at the round bale with their head buried right to the bottom and they don't come up for hours. Like, that's not development emotionally for a horse. There's very little stimulation in a lot of those environments, and they need more. And the trouble is we have to provide them more without having full access to the mountains. I mean, if you open the gate for a lot of our horses, they wouldn't make it either, right? They're just not, they're not equipped to survive like a lot of the wild horses do. So this is the cycle of destruction. It kind of relates all of the things I've talked about so far to a lot of these metabolic problems, and I bring this up because the metabolic conditions are first and foremost amongst the common conditions of the world that are taking our horses down. And it all starts with insulin, high cortisol, too much free radical damage or oxidative stress in the body, too much inflammation, and the cycle just continues. And so when you're trying to bring your horse back to health from a lot of these metabolic challenges, from insulin resistance to PPID to chronic laminitis or sugar-induced laminitis, you have to break this cycle. And the way you do that is with detoxification, better nutrition, and lower stress is essentially the goal there. So I want to talk now about what goes wrong with the gut, because usually this is a good starting place to start breaking that cycle. And I mentioned this yesterday, but the pH of a healthy hind gut should be between 6.4 and 6.7. And we care about that because the bacteria that form the microbiome or the ecosystem in the hind gut really care about their environment. That's what keeps them alive, and it also what keeps them in balance. So we want pH to be healthy, we want the food source to be healthy, we want the temperature to be healthy to maintain that ecosystem. And in most horses it's not, and this is where the acidity comes into play. So the over-fermentation of starches and sugars produce lactic acid, which lowers the pH. And this is horses that are living on green grass with very little movement, very little nutrition, and too much toxicity from other things. And what happens is the healthy bacteria start to die, unhealthy bacteria start to thrive. Now, when horses on grass, just to clarify, I'm usually talking about very minimal variety, right? These are horses that are just on green grass, so there's not a lot of variety in plants, nutrition, fiber sources. They're just out eating sugar basically all day long. If the pH of the hind gut drops too low for too long, the structure and function starts to become compromised and the intestinal lining starts to become permeable, which means things move in and out of the gut. So we don't want that because that means toxins start to leak out into the body. So now you have a systemic toxicity problem, which leads to a ton of inflammation. So the other term for this is called cecal acidosis. And you might see this in the literature or on Google if you were to Google this. The common term is leaky gut, but the real formal term is cecal acidosis. And that means that there's excess toxicity in the body that is leading to a lot of destruction. So excess acidity causes inflammation. So that starts to kill bacteria back there. And a lot of horses are living with this all over the world. And as healthy bacteria die off, more toxins start to be released. The acids and toxins in the hindgut starts to damage the intestinal lining and it becomes permeable. And then the toxins start to migrate into general circulation. So that includes waste products. So waste products from the fermentation process, unfriendly bacteria starts to leak out, parasite toxins, and maldigested proteins, all of which will cause a lot of inflammation in the body. And it causes serious health problems. So it also contributes to ulcers, both hindgut and foregut. So I have a hard time separating the two. If I'm working on one, I'm working on both. The excess acid triggers the release of histamines, that's why. So horses with ulcers, for example, that also have high histamines throughout the intestinal tract, they trigger more acid production. So now you're in a very heightened state of acidity, which means you're in a heightened state of inflammation. So histamines trigger more acid production, specifically more hydrochloric acid, which is produced in the stomach. And horses produce a ton of hydrochloric acid in the stomach to break down proteins and to also break down minerals and vitamins and other nutrients. So if a horse doesn't have this working well for them, they also don't break their vitamins and minerals down very well either. So here's just an illustration or a picture of what leaky gut looks like compared to a healthy gut in a horse. So on the left, you can see how tight the mucosal lining is on the inside of the gut. And then on the bottom, you can see it's just blood cells, right? You don't have any extra toxins in there. You'll also see that the tight junctions, so between the villi are very close together, so nothing's leaking out. And that's what we want. That's what we want to see in a healthy gut. In an unhealthy gut, you can see that the separations are starting to move from the damage. The mucosal lining is breaking apart, and you can start seeing all the unhealthy things, bad bacteria and viruses and toxins leaking through the villi out into general circulation. And it's rarely diagnosed. So don't rely on a diagnosis for this. I've just gotten really good at identifying it, both from history and also from presentation. So auto-intoxication wreaks havoc on the body, in other words. Health problems include, number one on the list is laminitis, which means basically inflammation of the lamina or inflammation of the hooves, arthritis, respiratory issues, allergies, skin conditions, thrush infections, and anxiety. I've seen it all with leaky gut. And the reason I know it was completely connected is because once you start healing the gut and you start repairing and removing all the toxicity from the body, all these things get better. And so from an allopathic standpoint, you might say, well, if he's got arthritis, I better just put him on pain medication, right? Take the inflammation down. We kind of absolve ourselves of the responsibility of asking why. Why are the joints so inflamed? It didn't just happen randomly. There's always reasons for it. Horses with chronic respiratory problems that just can't be explained. And skin conditions are very, very common too. So I don't know if you get like rain rot or sweet itch or a lot of those skin problems here that are the result of fungus and other pathogens, but we see a lot of that in Canada and the United States as well. And anxiety. We often don't associate anxiety with toxicity in the body, but if there's a lot of toxins in the body, it also affects the brain and it affects a lot of the nervous system too. So the other thing you have to remember when you're approaching leaky gut is don't forget about the liver and kidneys because they're trying to filter everything out. So the liver and kidneys then become burdened with the toxic load, which can then cause other problems, particularly of the immune system. And so for horses with this condition going on where there's a lot of toxins leaking out and it's circulating through the body nonstop, you will start to see them become very intolerant to things, all things in their food. You will say like, how come they're so swollen all of a sudden, or they're breaking out in hives, or they have all these problems they never had before, and they start becoming allergic to everything in their environment because their immune system is literally on fire from all the toxins that are circulating and leaking through their blood. So 75% of the immune system resides in the gut-associated lymphoid tissue in the gut, right? So that is your first clue that when you're supporting your horse's immune system, if they are prone to a lot of immune-related problems, whether it's autoimmune or just inhalant allergies, respiratory problems, skin allergies, you have to support the gut. You can have a really hard time supporting the immune system with a really bad toxic gut. So leaky gut is a primary cause of laminitis, and the lamina is just the definition of the lamina. It's a specialized tissue that is very sensitive to toxins. So I've seen horses get laminitis from everything from wrong food, including alfalfa, too much sugar, a particular supplement, a particular multi with too many preservatives and other ingredients in there, vaccines, medications, grief is another thing I've seen cause laminitis, which is more emotional toxicity. But if a laminitic horse is already on a low sugar diet and has a balanced trim, look for signs of this. So If you're happy with the farrier and the trimmer and they're doing a good job and they don't have any obvious pathologies, you're looking for signs of gut health, because a lot of this toxins will just go straight to the feet. So here's some other symptoms that you might not associate. I talked a little bit about this already, but irritability. They just generally don't feel good. They don't really want to be around other horses or humans, and when they are, they're pinning ears and shoving people and horses around. They have poor concentration. I see this getting blamed on a lot of horses, actually, like that horse just can't think. They have poor concentration. They just can't do this task. Meanwhile, their brain is literally not working, right? There's a lot of things that can really disrupt mental health in horses, and this is definitely one of them. Fatigue. Horses get very tired. Colic can be part of the symptom picture. Lots of bloating and distension. Weight loss can happen, but not always. I see this more rarely, actually, with the weight loss. Poor appetite, so they just don't feel that hungry, like they just don't have the same desire to eat. Diarrhea. So another important point to remember is if your horse has a leaky gut, they don't always have to have diarrhea or fecal water syndrome. They don't have to go together. A lot of people think, well, if it's leaky gut, it must mean it's fecal water diarrhea. Not the case. I've seen many, many cases of leaky gut where that's not part of the symptom picture, and it never was. And then you get your infections as well. So as I mentioned, about 70% of the lymph system is found in the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which resides in the intestinal lining and the tissues. And specialized cells take antigens from the intestinal tract to immune cells, and that's what initiates an immune response. So this is where I was talking about horses with leaky gut and a lot of toxicity start to get very sensitive. Their immune systems start to overreact to a lot of things in their life, including everything they're eating to inhaling. Anything that's coming into the body seems to put it on fire. And horses in a state of autointoxication are constantly activating an inflammatory response. So you'll see a lot of inflammation in these horses. Sometimes it's acutely triggered and sometimes it's just chronic. And that can lead to autoimmune conditions. So I recently did a podcast on eye health, especially like the uveitis or the equine recurrent uveitis. That is an autoimmune condition. And if you have this going on, you don't have a hope of recovery. The progression will continue to deteriorate. Like you will continue to get worse and worse and worse eyesight and inflammation in that eye because the body just can't release all the toxins fast enough, based on that load. So with these horses, you're watching for food sensitivities, intolerances, and allergies. So you might just say, oh my gosh, my horse is so sensitive. I don't know, how this happened or when it happened, but I can't feed him anything. Start with this, start looking at the underlying cause. So factors that lower pH alter the microbiome. So we've established that, and they cause leaky gut. So here are the main things or the main culprits that cause leaky gut. Forage. So unfortunately, horses have to eat forage, so we can't take that away from them. Anything they're eating outside of forage as well. So the concentrated grains and the feeds. Stress increases acidity, it lowers pH, and it causes a lot of damage to the intestinal lining as well. Dewormers. So I talked yesterday about, yes, you have to deworm, and yes, you have to use chemical, but be responsible about it. Don't over deworm for no reason, and make sure it's working for your horse. Don't go in blind and hoping for the best. And all medications. So there was a time I thought it was just antibiotics, for example, and dewormers that disrupted or killed off the ecosystem in the gut or the microbiome. I now know it's all of it. I see gut problems and leaky gut with horses that have been on long-term medications, from non-steroidals to the Cushing's medication to metformin and all the insulin medications. It's all of it that affects that ecosystem because it's so delicate and sensitive, and it's changing the environment in which they live. And I also put age here, but all age means it's just that they've been exposed to these things for longer. for a longer period of time and more of it. So the excess fermentation of sugars and carbohydrates is really the primary cause of leaky gut, but there's a lot of other things that contribute as well. So this includes all the grains. The one that drops the pH the fastest in horses, so when you go and look at your ingredient list, make sure it doesn't have corn in it. Corn is the worst out of all the grains. Some of them are all bad, but corn is definitely the worst. So I make sure that all horses I work with, that's not part of the ingredient list. Commercial feeds of all kinds, really. You've got to really understand and look at your ingredient lists. And grass. So just plain Jane grass with high sugar in it will definitely cause a lot of insulin resistance, especially in horses that just aren't moving, right? They have to be moving to be burning off that amount of sugar. And acids, toxins, and pathogenic bacteria get produced and damage the intestinal lining. That's the end result, in horses where this goes on for too long. So there's other things that do this, and I've made mention of them already, but you want to look at your excess proteins in alfalfa, your dietary oils, your feed byproducts, so everything else on the ingredient list, artificial flavorings and colorings, dairy byproducts. Horses are not cows, right? They should not be eating dairy products or anything derived from dairy products, including whey and molasses. So that's just a short list, but there's a lot of other chemicals and preservatives and ingredients that definitely contribute to this as well. So I have a couple cases. I always find it's better to see an example so you know which kind of horse you're looking for when you see this. But this guy, his name is Joey, and I just worked with him last year, and he's a 20-year-old pony. And his main health concerns was bloating. You can kind of see it in his barrel, swollen sheath, chronic scratches. So the chronic scratches is always a little bit of a red flag for me when I see a pony looking like this. I just kind of go, where is all the bacteria? Why is the immunity so poor? And for those of you that don't know, scratches is that infection that happens on the lower pastern or the lower extremity. And it can be really difficult to get rid of and worse in mud. So in this case, she was trying antibiotics to get rid of it unsuccessfully. It just didn't work, and it just kept coming back, and it never really quite healed. And then he also had nasal discharge, weepy eyes, and a cough, which seemed to be seasonal, but all this means to me is that the immune system is weakening. So we have a weaker in this pony, and lots of general inflammation, which got diagnosed as arthritis. And arthritis just means inflammation of the joint. But to me, I don't really consider it to be arthritis if there's no degeneration on the x-rays, because there's a lot of things like leaky gut that cause a lot of joint inflammation. So in a lot of these cases, all of a sudden the mobility just completely corrects itself. And there's no more limping and there's no more stiffness when they walk, because all the things have been removed from the body that are causing the inflammation. So this horse was a metabolic pony, definitely before I saw him, because he already had high insulin, which was 167, and she got it down to 61. And he also had high ACTH at 220. Normal range at the high end is around 10, so it's pretty high. But I didn't really take that too seriously yet, because I also know that this picture can also happen with a pony that's very inflamed for a long time. So meaning chronic inflammation, chronic laminitis, things like that. And he was being treated with medication for that. 25/7, I meant 24/7. That's some backwards numbers. On a 24/7 track system. So the pony had a pretty great lifestyle. So there wasn't a lot I really wanted to change there. There wasn't anything to change. He lived with a herd. He had free choice access to hay, but he wasn't happy. He was kind of standing in the corner a lot and not really engaging with humans or the other horses. And we didn't have a hay analysis. And sometimes I really like, well, a lot of the time I really like to have a hay analysis so I can see how much sugar is in there, how much protein is in there, like is there something in particular that's really out of balance that we can correct. I don't always get it, and it doesn't stop me from moving forward, because sometimes we can get great results despite the hay and what's in it. So this was the scratches, and this is what scratches looked like. So it's another name for it is pastern dermatitis, where it's just a festering infection that looks really raw. It can be very challenging and stubborn to heal. And even when it does kind of heal itself or scab over, something happens and it breaks open again, and it looks irritated. And I don't think it's too itchy for a lot of horses, but it definitely probably is aggravated. And she had a heck of a time getting a handle on this. Antibiotics didn't work, and his front was the worst. So he had a worse front right. So what we did was, I didn't have to do anything with lifestyle. Everything was pretty natural for this pony, but we definitely changed the diet. And she didn't have him on a lot, so I didn't have to take a lot out of the diet, but I definitely increased the fiber, even though he was on a track system on hay. And I added, the type of fiber I used in this case was beet pulp. And I used beet pulp because it is a prebiotic. And it also has some nutrients in it, but it is a great source of fiber that can really help heal the intestinal lining. I've seen it work very well for that. I also used a bit of wheat bran. And yes, I use wheat bran, and yes, it's a starch, but it works really good for healing the gut in very small amounts. Like, you don't want to go high with it. Like, I mean, no more than like a half a cup kind of thing, 3/4 of a cup. One thing with these horses is we make the assumption because they're so big is that they need lots of things, and they actually need less. Like, they are so simple and they're so good at absorbing the right things. You don't have to increase by much when you're trying to add bioavailable nutrition. So we started with that, and then I used some nutritional therapy. So back to the B vitamins, I used some B12, B6, calcium in this case. It's a great buffer for acidity. It's also really great for joints, and selenium. And I do those single, so not mixed in any type of formula. I do them all separately, all single, and then I added some herbs to that. So the ones that we used were the calendula, slippery elm, bentonite clay, chamomile, and Irish moss. All really good for digestion. And the slippery elm and bentonite clay I find is very effective for healing the gut specifically. So just healing the intestinal lining. So that was 3 months later. You can see how his coat has darkened quite a lot. And I see this in a lot of horses that start to feel better. Their coats just get darker. I don't know why. I don't know why, but it just happens. It's like one of the common signs of unwellness to me, or just poor nutrition, is a faded hair coat. So I like to see them rich in color, especially if that's the way they were early on in life. So there was a 90% improvement in swelling and fluid retention, and you can see that in his body, but the sheath swelling went down tremendously. And so when you see swollen sheaths or udders or lower extremities, it means the lymph system is struggling. And when the lymph system is struggling, the immune system is struggling. And that's how I knew this was kind of a leaky gut problem, because there was too much toxicity in the lymph for the body to clear. The scratches healed 80%, so we had an 80% improvement in the pastern dermatitis, and to her surprise, there was an 80% improvement to mobility as well. So these are all things that many owners think, this is just the way my horse is. I mean, he's a 20-year-old pony. How much improvement can I get? You can get a lot, because there's so many reasons for all this inflammation to happen in the first place. So the other happy surprise is that the mood improved, and he started playing finally. So he started playing with other horses and racing the thoroughbred in the pasture, and he was finally engaging again. So energy levels really struggle with these horses because they're under such a barrage of toxicity all the time. So that's the difference, and you can really see it after 3 months. You can see, can you see that, the difference in that? Yes? See? So you can see the bloating, right? The distension in the barrel has come a lot down. You can kind of see a puffy look to him on the left. He just looks kind of full of fluid. And then on the right, it's like everything kind of shrunk in, like the skin tightened a little bit. So here's the scratches starting to heal finally after 3 months. And, after all the antibiotic use and after all the things that she tried, this is one of those situations where she didn't really have a lot of hope. Like, I was like the last ditch effort to help her little pony out. And I was confident, but she was like, I don't know, but I'm going to do what you say. So anyways, it was a great outcome. And that was in January of this year. So I'll have another update soon for that one. And I have one more case I wanted to present. This one's a little bit more severe and a little bit different than what I normally see. So this guy was 18 when I was working with him, and he was a Morgan. Morgans are infamous for being very easy keepers, so they can be very difficult to manage on grass without a lot of movement. And he had been owned by his owner for 6 years, but prior to that, he stood in a field and ate grass for 12 years, relatively untouched. Many people would make the assumption that horses like this should be healthy. And while it sounds good that they've just been out eating grass and left to their own devices, we have an over-fermentation of starch and sugar here, right? Like all they're doing is eating grass. Probably he's not moving as much, like very little handling. And I don't know necessarily about the rest of his care, but we can't dismiss those horses just because we think they're in a natural lifestyle, that they're not prone or predisposed to some of the same issues as our domestic horses. So when he was 17, here's where the food allergy started. So at 17, she switched him to a 10% alfalfa hay. That's not a lot of alfalfa. And he completely blew up, meaning tons of inflammation, tons of fluid retention. And he was not in a very good health status at that point. He was sad and lifeless, so lots of depression, lots of fatigue. And he was diagnosed with equine metabolic syndrome. And at 18, he got really sick. And you can have horses that limp along that are kind of okay, but not doing the best. And you can have this where they're like half dead. And it's so severe that this condition is the last thing people consider. They're looking for something more severe, like an acute infection or something that's really wrong in the body that they can identify and medicate for. Not the case. So he became extremely ill with diarrhea, weepy eyes, and he was itchy. And when I say itchy, I mean down on the ground, rolling, scratching his belly, anything that he could find, he was rubbing his skin raw. Lamina were inflamed, so he had laminitis as well. So he had sore feet on top of it. And when they did the blood work at 18, the liver enzymes were elevated and the blood sugar was really high. And I don't know how much sugar he was eating at that time because I know she had made some changes, but this could be high just because of all the inflammation too. So it's not always because they're getting a ton of sugar poured into them. Sometimes it's just inflammation that causes the blood glucose to rise. So his other care, he was dewormed twice per year, and she rotated dewormer, so there was no concerns about that. The fecal count was 0, but she decided not to deworm that spring. She suspected allergies to alfalfa, which obviously he had an acute reaction to, so that would be off the table as far as going forward on the diet plan. For vaccines, he had an annual 6-way, but the vet recommended that she never do it again just because of how allergic he had become to pretty much everything. And when you see a horse that's allergic, they're immunocompromised, right? There's no other interpretation for that. So vaccines put a lot of pressure on the immune system, so you want to be extra cautious in cases like this. And she was so at her wit's end with how to help this horse, she ended up doing a skin parasite test. And even though it came back negative, they still treated, I think, for a skin parasite. And those are pretty invasive and they're pretty toxic. But she really didn't know what else to do to help this horse. So when I looked at the current diet, it wasn't terrible. She had already made some changes that were really positive. And this is all she had him on. So we had him on the spirulina, the milk thistle, which Gemma had talked about, which is very good for liver toxicity. also good for the microbiome. It can also be good for inflammation too. A probiotic, she had him on, so she's already starting to figure out how to support gut health. And then there was a multi-mineral mix in there as well. But she did have him on a lot of antihistamines just for relief because he was so uncomfortable and so irritable. She was getting ready to put him down just to get him out of his misery. So we just put together a new diet. That's all we did. And I started with beet pulp, and the reason I went with beet pulp because I knew that he needed a better microbiome, healthier microbiome, and beet pulp is just a really nice fiber. It comes from pectin, from the sugar beet, and it can be very helpful for reducing intestinal inflammation, and it's also a precursor to natural probiotic production. We don't use a lot of it, like you're not using buckets of it. You're using 2 cups after you soak it, which is not much for a horse, but it's enough. Wheat germ, so this is another one you don't hear a lot about in the equine industry, but it is one of the most dense source of bioavailable nutrition that you can find. It's the middle of the wheat kernel, and it has a ton of nutrition in it, and you don't have to use a lot. So when you're trying to give your horse a break digestively, things with a lot of dense nutrition in it is good, right? Because then you're not overtaxing the digestive system, but you're still getting a lot of nutrition into them. So it's good for a source of zinc and vitamin E. So really, we want to support the immune system as well as the digestion. And we did chia seeds, which is a superfood, which you probably all know for yourselves. You might even have some in your cupboard. High in omega-3 fatty acids and fiber. It also helps improve insulin sensitivity as well. And then I used some apple cider vinegar. And apple cider vinegar horses love it. If you have a horse that hasn't tried it, try it. I'm sure they will love you for it. I don't know what it is about the taste, but some horses will drink it. You don't want to give them buckets of it, but you can certainly give them a couple tablespoons in their mash. And it helps regulate pH, and it also really helps them improve digestion as well. And that's what we needed to do here. We are now working on regulating the pH of this horse's gut because it has been so damaged for so long. And I just said continue with the spirulina because more nutrition is better nutrition. So I kept this really simple, and to be honest, when I put together this program, I wanted to do a lot more because the horse needed it. But I also just wanted some little changes because the owner was just ready to quit. And I didn't want to overload or overwhelm her with too many things right off the bat and have her just kind of abort. So I just went with the 3 top things I thought were going to make the biggest difference. One of them is the probiotics, but I wanted her to do probiotics differently. I wanted her to do straight probiotics with nothing else in there that come out of the fridge. And we did vitamin B12, which he had never been on before, but B12 is extremely beneficial for liver detoxification. It is a bacteria itself, and so it's critical for carbohydrate metabolism, and it's also a nerve and stress nutrient. So I use this a lot for hind gut health for horses with leaky gut. So you can write down B12 if you think your horse might have a leaky gut, and probiotics. And then I chose zinc here too. And the reason I chose zinc is because a lot of horses are deficient in it. Zinc also has a really big impact on the immune system, and it really helps support the mucosal lining, especially of the stomach. So I'm looking for nutrients that kind of captures the symptom picture without having to do 25 of them. So I'm trying to pick the ones that are most suitable for his particular health profile. And then for herbs, I went with these blends, and I'm going to tell you what they are. So I always do Pro Digest for leaky gut. It's a blend that Riva's Remedies offers, and I do have some catalogs if you just want to see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about high quality supplements. But it has bentonite clay in there, slippery elm, chamomile. It did have some blueberry fiber powder, which is also great. And I think there's calendula in there too, but all of them are to support hindgut detoxification and healing, right? So you're wanting to do a real hindgut detox, and you want whatever plants you're using to help scavenge and heal, right? And you want to promote a healthier mucosal lining on top of that. And then the Equiderm, primarily for skin. Now, at the time, this blend had yellow dock in it, chickweed, and plantain, which I think Gemma talked about in her presentation, yes. And all of which are very good for skin, gut, immunity, detoxification, but that yellow dock there's nothing like it. I've had so much success with that one. Unfortunately, in Canada, our health department doesn't like yellow dock. So yes, they don't like yellow dock. And I think it's because there's some literature out there that has high toxicity in high amounts. But I've never had I've used it on countless horses. I've never had a problem. You just use a little bit, like a tablespoon, no more. And then we continued with the milk thistle too for this guy. So as you can see, I didn't change hay. I didn't pull this horse off grass. I didn't change anything about his lifestyle. All I did was add nutrition, basically. And I added some macronutrients that were conducive to supporting that microbiome in that hindgut. So the first progress report I got, which I think was about 2 months, I might have it on the next slide, we had a 50% improvement with periodic outbreaks. This was a huge win because this horse was close to being put down. This has been going on for years now with very little progress. So at 50%, that's a huge win. It was enough to show the owner that this might be possible. Like recovery just might be possible for this guy. No more laminitis. So all the inflammation in the hooves have disappeared. And the diarrhea had really improved as well, but it took 8 weeks. So you have to remember that these horses that have been sick or unwell for a very long period of time, to be patient with them. They didn't get here overnight, so you have to give it some time for the body to self-regulate itself and start utilizing the nutrition and balancing itself out a little bit. So that's at the first follow-up, and you can already tell, like she took him in the first class, and he was no longer dying to get down on the ground to itch. He was actually able to participate in the class and be pretty comfortable with it. And you can already see in that picture, his body had improved quite a lot. So at that follow-up, to keep going with the itchy skin, I used homeopathy here to finish the case, and I used a sulfur 30C. If you're not familiar with homeopathic sulfur, it is tremendous for really itchy skin. It's really good for itchy skin and also for inhalant allergies. So it just helps stimulate the body to address a lot of these things on its own. And I swapped the zinc for copper. So I went in another direction with these two minerals, and I started taking things away just to see if this horse would manage and hold. So the idea is not to use these things as crutches for a lifetime. You want to restore balance and then continue with all the things you're learning at these conferences to give them that foundation to sustain good health long term. So that's what he looked like probably about 6 to 8 months later, which was a huge improvement. And that is just gut health. That's all we were focused on, all the nutrients and all the plants we used and all the diet items that were recommended were just to improve gut health. So actually this was about a year, it looks like, about a year difference. So it does take time to heal, but this is about as severe as you see it, where you're starting to see high liver enzymes and you're starting to actually see, laminitis and acute skin problems and a lot of itchy skin. So leaky gut has affected most domestic horses at some point in their lives. There's probably some in this room. It contributes to many other equine diseases and health conditions, including laminitis, and it is not well recognized. It's rarely diagnosed, and it's not effectively treated when it is. So if you see your horse in some of what I described today, this is where I would start. Really start supporting the hindgut and start removing a lot of the things I talked about that cause or disrupt a healthy pH in the horse. So the question isn't if your horse has the ability to heal, but rather do they have the right tools to do it? Horses with the most severe health problems, it doesn't matter how old they are more resilient than you would ever think that they could be. They come back from the dead all the time. It's just, do we know how to do it? And do we know what they're asking for? So that concludes the presentation on leaky gut and cecal acidosis. A little bit more technical today, but I hope you all take away how important gut health is for your horse. And it's not just a matter of throwing a multi at them and calling it a day. There's a lot of things that they need for better health. And for those of you that weren't here yesterday or haven't taken advantage, I am offering a course bonus or a conference bonus. I have a little course called the 4-Step Guide to Resolving Equine Metabolic Syndrome Naturally. And it's a self-paced course. You get 20 video lessons. It's in English, unfortunately, but maybe you can translate it. Additional readings and PDFs. They have tons of charts in there for hay and feed and nutrient dosages and things like that. And you get the Facebook community as well. And I'm giving everyone 50% off before the 18th if you're interested in purchasing that. I have an email list up here for those of you that want to put your email list down or email down, and I'll just email everybody with the link to sign up if you want that. And if you don't want that, that's okay. If you want your email down, you'll start getting stuff from me, podcasts and other information about horse health. I send it out regularly, and that's the coupon code. So it's Spain 2025. You can put that in when you go to register, or you can just check out my podcast as well. Thank you, thank you. Oh.